let me introduce Ann Carpenter. Ann's kind of our go-to person here in town, and often we call on her to set the context. She is the Senior Community and Economic Development Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank. I don't know if you guys know all the things that the Federal Reserve Bank does, but it really has the data. It's who we go to often to set the context, to look at the data, not just for Decatur, but Decatur is not operating in a silo. We were operating in a region, in a state, in a country. And also worked at the, before Fed, she worked at the Georgia Tech Research Institute as a researcher. So it's in your program, you can read that. Without further ado, Ann, thank you for being here.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I just want to quickly thank Angela Threadgill, Andre Westbrook, the rest of the planning committee for giving me the opportunity to be here to talk to you all. And again, to thank you all for coming out, leadership and residents of Decatur. I also go to a lot of planning or housing meetings around the region, and I don't think I've seen a turnout like this anywhere, so it's quite extraordinary, especially on a Saturday. And so again, I am going to be giving you an overview of some housing data, some kind of macro data, but then drilling down to Decatur and Metro Atlanta data on affordability, focused a little bit more on rental housing, but I'll talk about both owner-occupied and rental housing. I do need to give the disclaimer that these comments are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And I thought it would be helpful, Bill mentioned that we do quite a lot of different activities at the Federal Reserve, and just to give you an overview of the system and the community development function that I work for. We get a lot of questions about why we're interested in this space, which I think are valid. It's not a well-known part of our activities. So first of all, in Atlanta, we are one of 12 regional reserve banks that, along with the Board of Governors and Washington, D.C., make up the Federal Reserve System. So this is our geographic area. We cover 6 states, really 3 full states and 3 halves of states. We do cover all of Georgia, and we're headquartered in Atlanta, of course. And we have branches around the district, so Birmingham, Nashville, Miami, New Orleans, and Jacksonville. So we're engaged in a lot of affordable housing conversations in our branch cities, but also in rural areas and smaller towns around the district. So the Federal Reserve as a system has a number of responsibilities. You may be familiar with our monetary policy function. So there was a meeting just this week where we voted to hold interest rates steady. So that's really the main reason why we make the news these days. But we're also responsible for the payment system, for cashing and checking, and then also for supervising and regulating our nation's banks. And we do have a brand new president, well, a year and a half that we've had a new president, Raphael Bostic. And he actually comes to us from the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Administration, where he was Assistant Secretary of Policy Development and Research under Obama. So he has a very keen interest in affordable housing, is very well versed as an economist and as a housing expert. And he's been really interested in engaging in these conversations. And some of you may have encountered him at housing meetings in the Metro Atlanta region. One of our other responsibilities under our supervisory responsibility is to regulate the Community Reinvestment Act, which was established in the 1970s to address redlining, discriminatory lending practices. And at that time, in the late 1970s, we, as a system, all developed or established a community affairs function. And so that's where I come in. So I work in what we now call our community development program. And we really, over the 40 years of the Act, have sought to help to increase investment in disinvested communities. And so CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, ensures that banks make investments in the same communities that they're taking deposits from. And so over time, we've kind of served as that conduit between the financial institutions and the folks on the ground who can guide that investment. Over time, that's evolved a bit, and in Atlanta, we tend to focus on a little bit more of building an evidence base. So doing some kinds of research projects or data collection, creating tools that can help to inform what's going on the ground in our district, and that's quantitative and qualitative, so doing case studies and things of that nature. And then we also have a deep engagement function where we go out into communities, we participate in meetings like this, but also kind of one-on-one or smaller group discussions to really help to make those connections with the mission of activating financial, human, and social capital in low and moderate income communities, so specifically in our district in the Southeast. And we do tend to focus on a few key areas. So I am an advisor in the community development program that specializes in housing and neighborhood revitalization. But we also have a lot of activities on workforce development and human capital, small business and entrepreneurship, and community development finance. So there's other activities. If you go to our website and are curious, we have a lot of work in those areas as well. And overall, I would say that the bank and our function as well are starting to focus a lot more on economic resilience and economic mobility. And in the South, in our district, we know that some of the levels of mobility are quite low. If you look at those zip code level data that have come out recently by researchers from Harvard and elsewhere. So that's been a major focus, and not just something we're looking at in community development, but something that the bank is embracing as well. And so as part of the activities that we do, the research that we put out, I just wanted to mention this report that came out in July, because I'll be talking about some of the data from it. So the Atlanta Fed, my department, along with the Schimberg Center at the University of Florida, Schimberg Center for Housing Studies, we put together very detailed rental housing affordability data for our entire district. So these are data that you can get at the city level for larger cities. Unfortunately, Decatur couldn't produce data specifically for this geography, but we also have metropolitan areas, micropolitan areas, so smaller metro areas, and statewide data as well. And we also are able to disaggregate the data by income. And so you'll see in some of the upcoming slides, we use those income categories that I think are also in your booklets, like extremely low income, very low income, moderate income. So we can see, which segments of the population are most cost burdened or struggling the most to pay their rents. So again, this is the report. There's a link, and hopefully we can distribute these slides so you don't have to write down that very long URL. But we also have a data tool coming out soon, and by soon it's Tuesday, as far as I'm aware. So that will allow you to actually manipulate the data and produce on-the-fly reports, and it'll be an interactive data tool using all of the information from the report. And that the report, I should also mention, has tons of data, like I said, but also has recommendations and kind of trend analysis of why we're in this situation and sort of what we can do to move past it. This way. So just as a quick overview, I will go through a few definitions of housing affordability, and again, you do have some of these definitions in your booklets, and they're on the display boards around the room, but just a level set here during our first kind of data presentation of the day, I wanted to go through a few of those. I have some general data on affordability, sort of macro data for the US and Georgia and Metro Atlanta, and then as I said, I'll drill down into what data we do have on Decatur, and then I'll talk about kind of the impacts of affordable housing as a benefit to the community and some of the strategies or potential resources that could be used to increase the supply. So in terms of definitions, and these are not exhaustive, there are even more, I think, in your booklet, but I'll use these a few times throughout my presentation and wanted to make sure we're on the same page. So we often talk about area median income when we're looking at affordable housing. There's a couple reasons for this. One is that many times subsidies have income limits or caps that coincide with the area median income and percentages, as you can see here, that are related to that AMI or area median income. But they're also helpful, I think, for planning purposes, so for conversations like this when we're really thinking about the families that have the most need, the populations that we need to produce more units to serve. The categories that I'll use and that I think are pretty commonly used are extremely low income. Those are folks making 30% of AMI, area AMI or below. For Atlanta, and Decatur is considered part of the Atlanta metropolitan area, and so under HUD's, the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Administration's rules, your AMI is set at the Metro Atlanta AMI, and that's about $74,800, I think, for 2018. So an extremely low income housing, or household, sorry, is a household that makes roughly $20,000 or less per year. The next category up is the very low income category, which is about 30 to 50% AMI. That's roughly $20,000 to $35,000 per year. And then you go up from there, low income goes up to 80%, moderate income up to 120%. And after that, we really don't have as many programs to subsidize, particularly rental housing. But we know that even upper income folks are, and you'll see this in some of the data around the room, folks in that category also have unmet needs, and there are cost burdens associated with upper income renters as well, and homeowners. A couple other definitions that we'll use. One is cost burden. So we consider a family cost burden if they are paying more than 30% of their income, their household income, on their housing costs. And that is a threshold that's been set by HUD for several decades. It comes from an old kind of piece of wisdom that 1 month's or 1 week's paycheck should pay for 1 month's rent. So 25% was kind of the standard pre-HUD 1980 standards being set. But today we think of 30% as really that threshold of affordability. Anyone paying more than that is considered cost burden. And what we've actually been seeing more and more is that folks are paying even more than that. So there's another category that's been created called severely cost burden, where you're paying more than 50% of your income on housing. And when you're making $20,000 a year, paying $10,000 or more of your income on housing, you can imagine there's not much left over to pay for your other needs. But again, affordability is relative, so upper income folks paying 50% of their income on rent, that could be a choice that's affordable to them. So that's why a lot of these data really do focus on low income folks. All right, so I'll go through a few slides on some macro data on the housing market in general, and kind of describing some of the trends that have led to this crunch in affordable housing and affordability in rental housing in particular. So first of all, we're looking at home ownership rates from the last 30 years. The blue line is the United States, the orange line is Georgia, and the green dotted line is Atlanta. And what you can see, of course, is that we've had a peak of home ownership prior to the housing crash during the sort of bubble, the run-up to the recession. In all three cases, we've seen home ownership rates decline during the recession and during the recovery, continuing to decline. It's only in the last, these are annual data too, the last kind of 2 years that we've started to tick back up in terms of home ownership rates. And the last quarterly data showed a very small increase once again to 64.4% for the nation. A couple things to point out though, it's probably clear to you that Georgia and Atlanta had a bit more of an extreme kind of peak to trough change. Georgia still is trending below the national average, which is kind of unusual. Most southeastern states actually have higher home ownership rates than the nation, but I think we were just affected a bit more by that housing bubble. And also, it's important to note that home ownership rates really are stagnating to some extent, partly because of foreclosures and the foreclosure crisis, tightening of credit, but also lower headship rates. So this is the rate at which people form new households. So people are maybe staying in intergenerational housing situations for longer, and that's really leading to kind of fewer households being formed. So that's the home ownership picture. I'd also like to point out data on income, and Bill alluded to this too, that while housing costs are increasing, and we'll see that in some other slides, incomes are not keeping pace and are relatively stagnant in real dollars adjusted for inflation. So this is again going back 30 years. You once again have blue data are the US, orange data are Georgia, and green are Metro Atlanta. And what you see is that really our incomes, while they've been increasing, these are annual data, they've been increasing in the last couple years, and wage data that's come out from BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, have shown increases in wages as well. They're really still, in real dollars, closer to kind of 1990s levels of income. So with the inflation that's occurring and with the increases in housing costs that you'll see, this is unsustainable for many families. And actually for renters in particular and for low-income families, these are median figures. This is kind of the central tendency, but for the lower income families, the wage appreciation isn't really keeping pace. So it's lower or even declining in some cases. And it's also, kind of startling to look at the increase in housing prices for sale housing or owner-occupied housing. This is an index produced by CoreLogic of home prices going back again 30 years to 1987. It's indexed to the year 2000. So you really can see this is U.S. data. Georgia and Atlanta kind of track similar. But of course there was a significant peak or a significant bump prior to the recession and during the housing bubble, which was followed by a deep fall off in prices. But we've seen that prices have really started to climb once again. And for Georgia and Atlanta, if you kind of draw that line across, the home price index has actually surpassed that pre-crisis peak. So then you'll see on another slide that indicator that price appreciation is even stronger. So we know that housing, it could be because supply is slightly constricted, it could be because land prices and lot prices are increasing. There's a lot of factors, demand, etc. But the price of housing is continuing to rise to levels that are quite unaffordable for especially moderate income and low income families. And I think it's important to also point out that the cost of housing as a percentage of income for renters versus owners, there's always been this kind of significant gap. So here you see these are national data and these are median data, so this is kind of the average household. For owners down here, they're paying more like 20% of their income on housing, whereas renters typically are paying closer to 30%. Again, 30%, put a green line there because that is what we consider that affordable threshold. But during the crisis and the recovery period, the average renter was even paying more than 30%. So housing in general was less affordable. It's coming down a little bit again, I think, because of that trend, slightly upward trend in incomes that we saw on a previous slide. But really this gap is significant and, if anything, growing between those two populations of renters and owners. And I've talked a little bit or alluded to the fact that when we disaggregate by income and look at isolating lower income families, housing costs and affordability concerns are greatly exacerbated. And so these are data going back to 1960 for just the lowest quintile of households in the U.S. And so these are the people in the bottom 20% of income earners. And over time, and this is the percentage of them that are cost burdened, again, paying 30% or more of their income on housing, over time it's risen quite dramatically. There's been some plateaus, but the overall trend is upward. And even back in 1960, a significant percentage, about 2/3, were paying more than 30% of their income or were cost burdened. But today it's closer to 83, 84%, which is quite extraordinary. And the numbers, the share that are extremely cost burdened or severely cost burdened are quite high as well. So this is just to, once again, draw home that point that this is a population that is really struggling the most at this point. So I wanted to bring it back to Decatur as well and to give you some statistics on the housing market here. And so these are Zillow data, two kind of indexes. One looking at the change in home values for sale housing on the left from 2010 to 2018, so all during the recovery era. And then on the right, those are percent changes in rent. And these are for 3 areas, for the U.S., for Metro Atlanta, and for Decatur. So obviously on the housing side, the homeownership side, you see a pretty extraordinary increase, positive percent change in home prices for Decatur, 85% over that time period. And that is much higher than Metro Atlanta, which is also higher than the United States at large. This is comparing to rents, actually. Rental house prices or rent prices in Decatur are more in line with Metro Atlanta, of course, about the same 26% increase over that same time period, 2010 to 2018. But for both, they tend to be higher than the U.S. average of 16%. And there's been some data coming out recently that rental prices are starting to plateau, but that's not universal. There are some markets that are continuing to see price increases. Many of them are out west, but it's something to keep an eye on. And I wanted to just draw your attention to some data that are on the boards around the room, which I think are really good visualizations of the unmet need in some of these income brackets and in terms of housing typologies. So what you see here, essentially, this is owner-occupied or for-sale housing. You can see that the purple area is the unmet need. We have these bars that indicate income levels across the spectrum, and then kind of housing availability or the share of units I assume that are available. And clearly what you see is that the most unmet need is really around this area for owner-occupied housing. And this is low income, very low income, but also median income households. So people making $74,000 per year and higher. I mean, we still have unmet need all the way up to $200,000. So essentially you see also that in terms of typologies, this blue area are townhomes and condos. And those tend to be the types of units that are most available and affordable to folks kind of making between 100% and 200% of area median income. So that's an interesting kind of middle market. It's not quite middle income, but you might call it the missing middle kind of typology of housing, and so on. So in the next slide, you'll see that these are the same, this is the same visualization for rental housing. So we also have income brackets going across the x-axis, and then we have this purple area of unmet need across those different income levels. You can see a lot of unmet need again in this lower income area, so really between 30% and median income. Renters are really struggling, but once again, you see a lot of unmet need even for, this would be kind of luxury rentals, people making $200,000 per year. This is interesting too. The yellow area is for single family rental units, which in the Atlanta metro is kind of a growing type of housing that's available, especially in single family neighborhoods, and presents some opportunities for renters, but tends to be really out of reach for lower income individuals and really more affordable for folks making 200% of median income and above. So again, plenty of gaps exist in many of these areas and certain typologies as well. There's also a snapshot on a couple of these boards on the housing market in Decatur and other really great information too that I was perusing this morning. But this one really again kind of talks about and points to the difference in the owner and renter segments and the types of housing that are available to them. About demographic change, especially in age of the population of Decatur. So people are aging in place, of course, which is great. Young children under 9 are sort of being, the share of that population is decreasing. And so, there's a lot of considerations about what this means for the future of housing and what sorts of housing typologies are necessary and needed. Is there going to be a need for more rental, for more kind of universally accessible or ADA accessible aging in place style housing units, and what is this going to do for prices as well? So moving back to a little bit of data on Decatur versus the metro, here I have a percentage of cost burden households, going back to that kind of statistic on what share of renter households are paying more than 30% or too much for their housing that is unaffordable. And you can see an interesting pattern here that this is the US, this is Metro, and this is Decatur. We have two different eras. These are 5-year estimates for 2011 and for 2016. So actually in the US and Metro Atlanta, you see pretty large shares, more than 50% of all renters, this is among all incomes, not just low income, are paying more than 30% or are cost burdened. But those shares are going down slightly in that 5-year period. However, in Decatur, while the shares are just a bit lower, and I'm not sure that this is statistically significant, I didn't run that differential, but the share is actually increasing in Decatur. So while other, other regions or regions that we're situated in are seeing a little bit of pressure releasing, in Decatur that does not seem to be the case, at least according to these data. And I also mentioned that in our report we were able to disaggregate these data by income, so I couldn't do this specifically for Decatur just because of the population size and the sample size, but if you look at the Metro Atlanta data, a similar pattern could probably be found in Decatur. And what we see is, this is again those same categories of extremely low income, very low income, low income, moderate income, and upper income, and then this is all renters. You see that there are very high shares of renters in the extremely low and very low income categories that are cost burdened. So more than 75%, more than 86% when you're looking at very low income renters, and even in the sort of moderate income or low income brackets, you see pretty significant shares. And this is 150,000 households in Metro Atlanta that are cost burdened renters. So this is another Metro Atlanta statistic that comes from our report that I mentioned. So we looked at cost burdened households by share, but also by numbers of households who are cost burdened. And then we looked at the supply side. So we tried to drill down into how many units are available and affordable to these households making these different amounts of income annually. And of course we found, given that there's these large levels of cost burden, that the supply isn't meeting the need. And so what we see here and how to interpret this is really for every 100 tenants in each of these income categories, these are how many units are actually available and affordable. So when you look at extremely low income, it's only 24 units, so only about 1 in 4 households at this income level can find a unit that's affordable for their family. That means they could be paying way too much, they could be doubling up, they could be facing eviction. There's a lot of outcomes that result from this condition. And then when we go up to 50% AMI, so that kind of very low income category, it's still low. It's still only about 1 in 2 households are able to find a unit that's available and affordable for their family. And then when we get up to 80% AMI, the shortage is much smaller, but there's still a couple of units that we're lacking. So I use these data to actually do sort of a back of the envelope calculation on the number of units that Decatur likely has a shortage of for especially this category, the very low income, 50% AMI and below population. And that's because on all of these charts and on many of the data points I showed, I really feel that that is the area of the largest need. So what I did was I figured out in Decatur and the city limits how many households, renter households, earn that amount of money, and it's about $35,000 per year or below. And then I multiplied the number of units by that figure of 47 or 0.47 and came up with roughly 865 units in the city limits of Decatur that we are lacking, that we need to house those people affordably and safely and securely within this community. So it's fairly significant. There's a lot of uncertainty to the number. I mean, with margins of error and with applying a metro figure to Decatur, I'm comfortable saying it's at least several hundred, but it could even be higher. It's a more detailed needs assessment might need to be done to really drill down a little bit more. All right, so I just wanted to close with a couple additional thoughts. So first, I wanted to use the last few minutes of my time as a call to action. I've said this a few times, but for low-income households, housing is increasingly out of reach, and I think that is really one of the high-level points that we talk about in a lot of our housing discussions. The 50% AMI, you'll hear, kind of that use as the sort of label for the population that we're talking about, but really these low-income households that rent, that do not have appropriate and affordable options. We also have noted that federal housing subsidies, while they haven't been kind of reduced to the levels that we once feared a couple of years ago, they really still aren't keeping pace with the need, and that's pretty clear from some of the data that I've shown. And many of the subsidies that we do have, I think some people don't realize they largely favor wealthy homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction and things of that nature. So only 1 in 4 households that qualify for and are eligible for a housing subsidy or some kind of housing assistance actually get it. So you have long wait lists for Section 8, you have just a lack of resources across the board. So it's not an entitlement, it's not something that a low-income family is just going to receive automatically. Of course, we have existing affordable housing units that have been financed through various programs or naturally occurring, what we call naturally occurring market rate, that's affordable rental housing, that's at risk. And so some of that is because programs like LIHTC and HOME, which you'll hopefully hear about more. LIHTC is the low-income housing tax credit, but one way to finance new units. They have affordability requirements that expire after a certain amount of years, 15 years. And so in the next 10 years, in just the city of Decatur, there are about 4,000 units under these programs that are set to expire. So they may remain affordable, but it's just as likely that they could go market rate with the amount of demand for housing and for people to move into this area. And then, of course, our unsubsidized units are at risk for demolition if they're older housing stock, or for being converted and upgraded to more luxurious apartments. We also know that costs are increasing, labor and lot costs, other input costs, so deeper and deeper subsidies are really necessary. And so this is the great part. Local action is needed, and we have a room full of energized folks and I think a lot of great minds. So this call to action you've already stepped up to the plate on. And then just really briefly, I wanted to go through a few benefits to communities around affordable housing. So the evidence that we have, we really can show that having affordable housing or a mix of income options for housing in a community has a lot of benefits. And so they can be reduced commute times and congestions because people can live close to where they work. You can see better health and well-being outcomes, better education outcomes, especially as your teachers and your healthcare workers can live in the same places that they work, and that also forms social cohesion. Economic stability and economic mobility for the families that are able to gain these subsidies and get housing that's affordable. And then this is an interesting infographic. There are several of these that are produced by Our Homes, Our Voices. And I like this one because it talks about jobs, and that resonates with a lot of decision makers. You can see the amount of jobs, the amount of income generated, and the amount of tax base increase. So there's several of these that they love for people to share on their website, Our Homes, Our Voices. Others are around health and education. And just really brief, go through a few strategies to set the table for our later conversations and brainstorming. But I think really defining the problem is such a key first step, and we're starting to do that today, I think. Identifying what resources are out there, what subsidies at the local, the state, and the federal level, nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, employers that may have resources to bring to bear, bringing folks like you all together to talk about partnerships between the public and the private sector and nonprofits. I do think it's important for many jurisdictions to look at their zoning, land use, their building codes, their parking requirements, and to see and to talk to developers and others about how that could be limiting the ability to produce more units and increasing costs overall. You may still have some distressed or vacant property in some of these property level surveys that could be targeted for acquisition for new units or new developments. Moderate rehab is a terrific way to keep costs low on existing, those subsidized and naturally occurring affordable units, to keep those costs low by keeping the rehabilitation costs, rehab costs low, and allowing the rents to stay low in that way. And then there are other models in between kind of home ownership and renting, like community land trusts, which have been used in Florida pretty extensively. We have a new one in Atlanta, which is really exciting. And that's a model where the land is leased by the homeowner who actually owns the structure, But by keeping that land in trust, it remains affordable long-term and allows the homeowner to accrue a small amount of equity. So it's kind of a win-win on both ends. And so with that, I will, I think, open it up for a few questions if we have time. Okay.
And these would be really clarification questions. And
I was wondering, this is in regards to the unmet needs chart for available housing to income.
Yeah.
And in reference to the condominiums and townhouses, I was wondering if they factored in the association fees that are required, because that would increase, the monthly cost for housing dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. To be honest, Andre, do you know that question? Those were data that was pulled together by the city of Decatur, and I'm honestly not sure. It would significantly increase the cost. So when we usually talk about rent, we actually use gross rent, which includes utilities and all the other costs. So hopefully they're doing the same thing with condominium ownership. But I would have to go back and check on that. That's a good question.
but probably not, which means it's worse than it looks, right?
Absolutely.
Right over here. And we're just only going to take a few questions.
Yes, Ms. Carpenter, I'm John Lee. I was asking, you had a phrase in there that affordability is relative. And I would like an amplification on that, because is it relative to the income people possess, or is it relative to the cost of building and maintaining a structure or structural factors? It could be looked at as relative to one or the other. And you can control the structural side possibly. So I'd like to know if that's what you meant, structural or income.
And also geography. I mean,
Yeah.
this would be cheaper here than New York City.
Totally. I mean, I guess what I meant actually in that slide was that when we think about these income categories, affordability, so that cost burden measure is more relative. So, if you make several $1 million and you're spending $750,000 a year on your housing, that's probably, you're well over 50%, but, your cost burden, but you're still able to afford a very comfortable lifestyle. So things like that is kind of what I meant. Like if you're making $10,000 a year and spending $7,000 on housing, how do you make ends meet? So that is extremely unaffordable. But yes, I mean, there's so many other considerations, so I'd be happy to talk about that.
Hi, I have one other. In one of your slides, you mentioned federal housing subsidies. Could you talk a little bit more about that, clarify, and give more examples? You mentioned Section 8. You also mentioned that it favored the wealthy. Could you expand on that just a bit more, please?
Sure. So there are several different programs that we kind of I lump in when I'm thinking about this that are targeted towards folks making like $10,000 and $20,000 per year, very low income, with the most need, and that's home and LIHTC, Section 8. And the levels of funding for those programs have kind of ebbed and flowed. I mean, after the stimulus, they started coming back down. It looks like Congress is approving a little bit higher in the past couple of years. But then when you look at what we have on the books for homeowners, and these are particularly for homeowners making like $200,000 or more per year, they're getting, assuming that they have a financed house, the mortgage interest deductions that they receive are, in terms of like dollar amounts, not dollar amounts, are incredibly high compared to those subsidies that are given for renters, for low-income renters. And I have a chart on this. I did not include it, but it's so lopsided that, I mean, there's arguments that they're different kind of mechanisms. One is a tax credit, and one is a deduction, but really we're giving away the money, through Treasury, in one way or the other.
You have a question?
Please give us a little more information about exclusionary zoning and other restrictive policies.
Sure. Yeah, so there are a number of ways that exclusionary zoning can affect affordable housing. So there's things like minimum lot sizes or minimum square footage of units that can make, raise the cost for developers, but also make the unit itself less affordable. There's parking requirements are often required. Sometimes that's waived around transit stops or, maybe in Decatur, I'm not sure, but some progressive cities are starting to look at that and for affordable housing, waive those requirements. But that's another way that has typically reduced the amount of money that goes towards unit generation, and it really goes towards those other costs of the infrastructure itself. And then, of course, just reducing the density requirements. So keeping multifamily or townhomes or some of these lovely examples of past typologies of triplexes and quadruplexes in many of our communities. Those have been zoned out, even though we know that that's a great kind of missing middle housing typology, essentially. Yes.
Has any assessment been done of the Carson changes to HUD in terms of affordability, the availability of federal money to enhance affordable housing?
So it's difficult for me to talk about.
Well, I can answer that.
Yeah.
There's less money and it's harder to get. Their narrative is we're not working hard enough for it.
Good morning. What I'm hoping that I got the gist of most of what you said before I had to run next door to the bathroom. So most of these things that you're referencing are really HUD programs as compared to Federal Reserve programs, correct?
Right. We do not have programs. We're not a grant-making institution. We're more involved in kind of providing the data to the decision makers and sometimes examples or case studies of policies that have worked elsewhere, often local and state policies more than federal.
So there's a book, if I don't remember what the name of it or something, that has all of the programs for HUD. It's just called Programs of HUD or something that people can download.
Yeah, there's a great resource from, is it National Low Income Housing Coalition? One of those that compiles USDA, Federal Home Loan Banks, HUD, I think some of the state level programs all together.
But there's a major, most of them still feed out of the programs for HUD stuff, right?
Yeah, a good amount, or USDA, yeah.
Okay. So we can get these slides from you, right?
Fine by me, yes. I will work with Decatur with Angela to get those to everyone in the room. Absolutely.
Okay. Or I can get them directly.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think we're going to have all the material you're seeing today, we're going to make available. Last one.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ann. One of the last slides made reference to affordable housing, boosting the education system. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the things that I think is more and more clear are the sort of social determinants of health related to housing. So, how your personal and mental health, your physical health, it relates to whether or not you have a stable place to live. And then kind of building on that, education. So, there are some neighborhoods that we've been working with in the Atlanta metro that have extraordinary rates of eviction, like 80% of eviction rates in one particular apartment complex that feeds into a school where the majority of the student body comes from that. It's actually Section 8 project-based housing. And so it has spillover effects on the whole community when you have a failing school and, the landlord's really failing to properly maintain those units. It's not just that people decided not to pay their rent that month or something like that. And they're still getting plenty of subsidies from HUD because it's project-based Section 8, which is a HUD program. So, having stable housing, affordable housing, and keeping kids from moving in and out of the classroom multiple times per year, there's a lot of evidence around how that impacts overall education attainment, but particularly for those students who are facing evictions and things of that nature.
So I'm going to stop it now. We're a little over our time. It's always good to have a friend who loves data, who understands data. She doesn't have programs,
No money.
but no money except they control the bank.